Today is the day that we say goodbye to cows. It is one of the decisions that we've made on the farm. Okay? Yes, one of the decisions that we have made is to no longer have cattle. And we shall discuss that in further detail in a moment.
So before we go forward, we're actually going to go back, just because we know we've had lots of new people join us since last year at around this time, and kind of go into why did we get the cows in the first place, or why did we think we could try cattle in the first place. And it goes back to last year and years before that. We had a herd of Oberhasli dairy goats. We just kind of realized for a few factors that the goats weren't working well for us, not because there was anything wrong with the goats or having a goat herd, but we also have a herd of sheep. And the number one issue there is parasite sharing is a big deal. So with the Oberhaslis, to get the milk production we wanted and just keep the breed going, we pretty much had to have as big a herd of goats as we did sheep, because as you see in some of our other videos, it's not always just as simple as grabbing an animal and having a small number of them. But that's a whole nother digression. So we figured we would try cattle, because cattle are more productive and fencing is easier because you can put them out on pasture and they're more predator proof and all those other wonderful things. But after sort of being immersed in that for a little while, we've come to a few realizations. So as far as the cows go, the best way we can put this is it wasn't a decision made by just any one factor. It's kind of like a layered effect. So there was various things that were involved with this, and some of them we knew going into it. I mean, just the big thing with cows is if you're going to produce milk and or meat, they have to be bred, which is a common reoccurring theme with any livestock. If you're producing meat, somebody had to breed it to get that meat. Essentially, some things we've thought at great length and gone around and around in circles are the breeding. There's AI, using bulls for the breed that we have. For the one breed we had, pretty much bulls were the option. For the other breed, AI was an option. Having to crossbreed was another consideration, which of course for us, pretty much any animal we get into, and plants and everything too, we're getting them for very specific reasons. So the crossbreeding usually doesn't complement that well, because you're potentially losing, this is one way to look at it, you're potentially losing whatever it was that attracted you to the breed in the first place. So that's a big consideration. Fencing, not quite so much, but management. We started to realize that cows are big, which sounds silly, but it's something not to forget, because at the end of the day, the cow is going to do what the cow wants to do, and that requires investments in pieces of infrastructure such as head gates, and the list can kind of go on and on and on. And some people do really well with very minimal setups, and other people require a lot of setups. So it's all just things that factor into it, infrastructure costs, etc., which kind of leads us to, I think, what became the final deciding factor was when we actually sat down and looked at some financials.
So, as Chris kind of said, sort of final nail in the coffin, so to speak, was looking at the numbers. The numbers were hard for us to really kind of sit down and look at and justify. If you just had the cows and nothing else and didn't have it adding to other things, it may have been okay. But when we kind of we got Danny and Dorothy in, when did we get them? November of 2020. And from then till now, we just took the amount of inputs we'd put in, took that dollar figure of value and divided it by the number of months to give us how much it would have cost for a full year to feed each cow. And the full-size cows, and this is being really, really, really generous, came out to about $936 a year. Now, keep in mind, we are in an environment here where essentially you're hay feeding for 7 months of the year, and then you have pasture for 5. You might be able to bleed a little bit on that, either side of the pasture months with kind of less hay, but still, we work in square bales, and that adds up really, really quite quickly. So it just came down to the fact that for us to have a herd of cattle, which is sort of what you were going to be aiming for, the numbers were too high, and it would mean something else had to give, I guess.
So I guess after kind of going through that, this kind of goes back to the video we did not that long ago about sort of a vision for the farm or homestead, whatever you want to call it, growing food. Is we're not so much gearing it for a business per se. I mean, the business side of it, potentially making some income, is always something to consider when you're homesteading. But for us, the sustainability, as we kind of defined it there before, is sort of the more important piece. And it's not by any means that cattle can't be sustainable by that definition that we gave, but there was just other factors when we, long story short, we kind of as a family had decided the sheep were more valuable, not for their dollar value, but for their what they brought to the table from the actual homesteading, as far as feeding us other products we could get from them, and this potential to milk them, which is still to be seen, than the cows. When you offset that with the cost, the outlay of cost, the outlay of infrastructure, the outlay of equipment, as Stephanie mentioned, we feed square bales, which are more expensive, but they're more manageable on a smaller scale. But when you start getting into cattle and round bales, you definitely need equipment, which goes into another change that we haven't actually talked about. We no longer have the tractor.
And somebody's very excited about that. Look at the smile on his face as he said tractor.
Well, it's just one of those things, again, sort of justifying to a lot of people, having a tractor is a necessity. And I think when you're raising cattle, people do it without it, but it's definitely advantageous. And the more independent, we're going to put it that way, that you try to get, the more infrastructure you're going to need when you start looking at tractors and head gates, potentially more barn space. Fencing's kind of a lower cost for cattle, but you may even get into having to do transport for your own trailers and this sort of thing, which there's lots of ways to sort of farm that out to others, but then that also feeds back into your costs. So another thing that was part of the consideration here, obviously, was that, I'm going to say, the output. What would you have gotten back from them? And of course, with cattle, you're getting milk. Well, the cattle that we chose, it would be milk and beef. The beef side of it is interesting because, not that we always do this with everything, but essentially the size of the animal pretty much put it out of our capabilities to regularly, I guess, butcher that ourselves. So even though for other animals we do take them to the butcher, we have the ability to do it ourselves because they're smaller. And that's actually, small livestock have a lot of benefits in that they are small, they're more portable. So sourcing new ones, although it can be difficult, is even if you have to travel to do it, it doesn't take the same equipment, which kind of goes back to that infrastructure piece. But essentially, yeah, with the cows, we were going to have to figure out sending every single cow to the abattoir to get it processed, which again, there's nothing wrong with that, but the loss of abattoirs in our area is not beneficial for that. Essentially, you could get into trouble in the future, or into more trouble, especially not being able to do it yourself. On the milk side of it, that was the hardest one, because cows and goats are the traditional big milk producers. There's really no question about that. But we are really excited, and this is something we will talk about more, to see if we can make our sheep herd produce at least a substantial portion of the milk requirements that we would use as far as cheese and that sort of things. But we will come back to that one. So in trying to go through this exercise to sort of reach our vision goal, or the quest for our vision, however you'd like to put that, part of this goes back to how we often operate trying to maintain populations. And it doesn't always work. And some things are easier to do that with than others. And it's very difficult to do that with cattle, unless you go to a pretty big scale, where you then need more land, more infrastructure, you have more outlay, etc. Essentially, as we've said a couple of times, it really was coming down to we would have had to choose We probably could have kept the chickens, but a lot of the other things that we raise probably would have been out of the question because we would have needed that time, money, infrastructure to make the cows work. And we still wouldn't necessarily have had a lot of resiliency because in the case of the sheep, we can keep sheep, different males, etc., to keep a more diverse population. It's very hard to do that with cattle because unless you have a lot of land and a lot of infrastructure and resources, you're probably not going to keep multiple bulls. You might keep multiple cows, but then you're essentially always dependent on what others are doing. And I mean, even down to just keeping a single cow. You could have had one cow that you milk and you get it AI'd, but you're very, very dependent on a specialized system to keep that going. Kind of in conjunction with expense, those were two things, lots of inputs, and very difficult to rationalize in the perspective of that sustainable vision that we've got going, I suppose. Now that being said, are cows still an option for people? Absolutely. We're just saying kind of not an option for us. And it really does go back to that need when raising cattle to either be okay with the dependency, i.e. if you're dependent on AI then and comfortable with that, then that's fine. Or the need to develop quite a business model to you're going beyond homestead scale often. Not always, but often, and you have to have those resources to do that and then build a market, i.e. probably the most reasonable thing on a smaller scale is a direct market beef sales, like grass-fed beef sales, or you're feeding into a more conventional system of, taking them to the stockyard, and if that works for you, great, but it just wasn't what we were hoping for, as we were hoping for the output to go back to be beneficial to us first, and then the other side second.
In conclusion, in our quest to fulfill our vision, which is a very long-term goal, the cows are gone. Daisy went to a wonderful family that was very much looking forward to having the homestead cow, and Danny and Dorothy have gone to a person that is very happy to work with the breed, already has the breed, and is continuing to grow their grass-fed beef operation. So everything kind of went win-win, but stay tuned as we kind of keep going on this quest for the vision and talk to you a little bit more in our next video about how we've made a few more decisions with some of the other livestock on our farm.